Welcome back to the Pool Pro Podcast, episode number 18. On today's episode, Terry Arko discusses the importance of source water for startups, but also how often you should be checking your source water for all the pools you maintain. Take a listen now.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Michelle Kavanaugh, co-host of the Pool Pro Podcast. We also have Dave Rockwell.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, and then we also are doing something a little bit different today. We're going to do a dual or a co-released podcast with Ask the Masters. We have Dave Penton from Ask the Masters podcast on today. Hey, Dave.
Hey, how's it going? Happy to be here, and this is going to be a great conversation. I always love the opportunity to interface with the service professionals in our industry, and so I'm going to be here representing the builders, and for you builders out there that listen to our podcast, there's definitely things in here that you're going to be able to pull out, and the whole thing may not be relevant to you, but there's definitely I still encourage you to stay tuned and listen to the whole thing, because there's really some things and misconceptions that we're going to try and knock down for you. Yeah.
We have a special guest today, Terry Arko from Hasa, who's I've known for a long time, was part of NSPF, and still a PHTA instructor now. But we're excited to have you, Terry. We're going to talk a lot about chlorine, liquid chlorine, source water, and lots of things. So we're excited to have you. Welcome.
Hey, good morning, Michelle and Dave, I guess I'll say, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
You bet.
So Terry, what we wanted to talk about with you today is you're kind of the chemistry guru, especially as it relates to liquid chlorine chemistry, but we're especially going to focus today on how our source water affects our water chemistry and how we treat our water, how we start up pools. And so that's what we'd like to get into with you today.
Yeah, great. Actually, great subject. And it's a subject that's near and dear to my heart. And I'll tell you, first of all, just so you know, I started out as a pool service tech a long time ago in Southern California. That's what got me into all this. So I guess in a lot of ways, I dealt with water for most of my life. I didn't really get into really thinking seriously about source water until probably, I guess, maybe about 10 years ago. And I was working actually for a water company. I was working for a company that actually made portable disinfection treatment systems. And they were selling them primarily into India. Somebody gave me a book called The Blue Death. This is what got me on the source water kick. And I've been on it ever since, but they gave me a book. It sounds like a terrifying name. It's called The Blue Death. It was written by an epidemiologist or a scientist called Robert Morris. And basically in that book, he just traced how sort of all the great public health, I guess, issues or tragedies were really born out of source water. And he went back to the 1850s to London, back in the day when they had no concept or no idea of germs or bacteria, or that could even be spread in water. In fact, back then they thought that they had outbreaks of cholera, and they were blaming the outbreaks of cholera basically from odor in the air, from stink in the air. They didn't have real good sewage systems at that time. And then sewage began to reek through the ground into the River Thames and then put the cholera, and they were using that same water for drinking water.
Oh, geez.
So it's a fascinating book. It talks about that. It talks about one of the biggest major crypto outbreaks in the US, 403,000 people in Milwaukee in 1993 that were sickened from drinking water. This was coming in from the tap. And it was crypto. And as we know in the pool industry, we've learned a lot, especially in public pools, about crypto and how crypto is chlorine resistant. So it takes a lot of chlorine to inactivate a crypto cyst or germ. And they actually found and discovered that the source of the crypto that got in that drinking water in Milwaukee was basically from cow feces that had frozen into the snow in the winter. And then when that snow melted and went into Lake Michigan, and it was just above the treatment center, that crypto went into the treatment center, and the chlorine they were using was not enough to inactivate it, and it sickened people. So just from that standpoint, I started reading more, I started researching more about source water, and I thought, it's really important to understand our source water. And then, later on, I began to do some other research, finding out that the EPA, who mandates source water and, under the Safe Drinking Water Act, they actually have instituted for municipalities what they call a corrosion control mandate. And so basically what that means is the pipes underneath the ground that are delivering the water into our homes and our swimming pools are very old. Some of them very old. They're galvanized. Some of them are very old metal, and they're beginning to corrode. It's very costly to replace those pipes.
Yep.
So EPA has mandated what they call corrosion control, and municipalities have to practice this. And a big factor of their corrosion control is using orthophosphates, using an ingredient that puts orthophosphates into the pipes and lines the pipes with orthophosphates. And now that they've mandated that, and the majority of facilities are practicing this, you have phosphate coming out. And so I was led to look into that because we, at the time, sold phosphate removers. Phosphate removal was beginning to become something new in the pool industry. And I actually had pool techs, service techs, who were reporting to me that the phosphates in their pools were just strangely going up. And it usually or typically was around the time that they topped off or filled the pool.
So you brought in a couple of rabbit holes we can go down, but the phosphate issue I encounter in LA all the time. They don't do it all the time. They do it in spurts, it seems like.
Correct.
And you'll go through a relative peaceful time in your fight with algae, and then all of a sudden it'll bloom and you test for phosphates, and sure enough, they've run phosphate through the system. We know the corroding pipes is a problem because Sunset Boulevard is tore up frequently in different places when the pipes break. So that's a huge issue, and that is something. So that brings up a question of how often do you think a pool tech, once a pool is full, once it's started up, balanced, everything's great, how often should we test our source water apart from the pool water?
So when I teach water temperature classes and so forth, basically my sort of general rule of thumb, if it's residential guys, I'm going to tell them at least seasonally they should be, so I'm talking like maybe winter, spring, fall, 3 times or so a year. They should, and definitely seasonally, I will tell you, water changes quite a bit based on the seasons. I can just, an example up here, I'm up in Seattle, Washington State area. And, up here, we have a lot of growth up here because we have a lot of rain. We have a lot of trees. And in the fall, we get a lot of leaves that dump. And I can tell you, like my street sometimes is buried in leaves. And those leaves are going down into the system, and they're washing down into the system. And those leaves are ending up in a lot of the municipality drinking. So there's a lot of tannins, things like that are being introduced. So that's just one seasonal thing that happens that changes basically the makeup and the structure of your source water. Wintertime, the water's colder, so there's different reactions. In summer, things are changing. So definitely seasonally. I also say in some cases, if it's a drought, if you're in the middle of a drought, you might want to, it might be weekly, it might be monthly that you're checking it, because water levels are changing. Water sources are changing. During the last drought they had in California, in the Bay Area, Northern Cal Bay Area, they basically switched their water overnight. Their water source was switched overnight. They were taking it from the estuary, but the water was going low, so they started pumping it in from Sacramento. Mm-hmm. Completely different water, completely different water change.
That happens down here in Southern California too, though. They used to get a lot of their water from the Colorado River, and that would be a lot higher in calcium, a lot different makeup of the water. And then when they switch to buying it from Northern California, we get a lot lower calcium hardness and a lot more aggressive water coming in.
So let me bring in the builder's perspective here a little bit. So as a builder, why can't I just, turn this over? Do I need to be paying attention as a builder? Because, once the water's in the pool, I want to just be able to pawn it off on the pool guy. And, but listening to you guys talk about it, it seems like it's really important for me as a builder to understand kind of what the source water is, not only, as we're filling that pool on the initial startup, but even potentially how much calcium is in the water that we're using at that particular property when we're mixing the plaster and everything. So can you kind of understand, or can you kind of explain a little bit how source water affects plaster dust, and then potentially your pool even in that first couple of days?
Sure, absolutely. Really vital. And I think for any builder, wherever they're at, when you're doing a job, finishing a job, definitely knowing the makeup of that source water is going to be really vital. And as you pointed out, Dave, I think it's vital from the standpoint of knowing, is that water really soft? So is it lacking in calcium? Is it lower in calcium? Which means that water, when you have soft water that's low in any kind of mineral, water naturally desires or naturally craves to be balanced. It wants a certain amount of mineral. And if it doesn't have it, it's going to try and obtain it from any source it can get. So plaster, that's like a feast. It's a banquet for soft water, calcium, magnesium. Those are two primary ingredients, I believe. So, at any point, at any time, when you're mixing that or whatever, there's definitely, if you're doing that with soft water, it's going to affect, what's in that plaster. And certainly when the pool's plastered, it's definitely going to start to pull that calcium up through the top of the, the surface of the plaster. So just from that standpoint, it's important. But I can give you a couple other things that I work with builders. And I think just understanding and knowing the source water and not assuming. I had a builder up here in Seattle, and they built a pool, got it all ready to go. And this builder, they would do a little initial testing, before they turned it over to a pool company to do the startup. And one of the tests they would always do is they test for metals to see what the metals were as well. And in this case, there was some assumption going on, and they did some of their initial tests. They do an iron test, found out, oh, no iron. And they also were assuming that this was softer water because they were assuming it was river water. That we have a lot up here, a lot of sources up here. So they filled the pool, kind of took care of what they needed, turned it over to a service company for startup, and that service company did their due diligence. But once they got to the point of adding the sanitizer and the chlorine, poured the chlorine in, the entire pool turned root beer brown. Didn't know why. And then suddenly they're finding high levels of iron. So what we realized, we did research and we realized that actually this was in a neighborhood in Washington, Redmond, Washington, where on one side of the street, the water was pulling from the river, pulling from a river. But if you cross the street, the houses across the street were pulling from wells, deep wells. And those wells were very low because it was summertime. And what they actually found was there was iron bacteria in the bottom of some of those wells that was coming up to the source water. So it was bacteria that was attached to iron. So when you did the test initially, you didn't pick up any iron. But once they put the chlorine in, and that bacteria, chlorine kills bacteria, the bacteria died and it released the iron, lots of iron, and caused the pool to turn brown. But there and again is a situation where they didn't really test the source water, or they didn't know the source of the water. They assumed, hey, this house across the street's on the river, so this must be on the river too.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of talk about the relationship a little bit between builder and service guy, because in something like that, it's very easy for the builder to just say, oh, the service guy messed up. He must have thrown something in there. And you know, many of you that have been around the podcast, both of our podcasts, know that Dave Rockwell does most of my service and startup and everything on the pools that I build. And as a builder, I think it becomes a critical relationship to make sure that you and your service guy are on very good terms with each other, because something like that, if you're throwing that in the lap of the service guy and you're throwing the service guy under the bus to your client, you're actually doing a disservice to everybody. And so understanding those relationships is really a key component, because keeping those lines of communication open, I'm sure in that situation was very critical to understand that, that this wasn't a maintenance or a service guy screw up in any way. It was what it was. So yeah,
Absolutely.
thanks. That's a really great story.
No, absolutely. And it's very vital that, you know, we got to work together. And fortunately, in this situation, everybody was professional. Everybody was just trying to solve the problem. There was no finger pointing, no blame. And I think that allowed us to actually get to the point where we were able to find out what we did. So that's a good, very good point.
Yeah.
That relationship the relationship between a builder and a service person, to me, is highly important. I work for different types of builders. Guys like Dave care deeply about their projects. I mean, they're on these jobs a lot of times for years, and so it's kind of like their baby. And when they hand it over, it doesn't mean they get their final check and they're done looking at the pool. A lot of mass market builders don't want to be bothered, don't want to hear about it after the fact. And only when there's an extreme problem where they get dragged in, at that point, they're kind of like, hey, what happened? You know what? Because they've had no communication with the service company. So I think one of the things that we talk about all the time is how important relationships are in this industry. And having a working relationship. When I start up a pool, I send Dave a text that has all the parameters, the LSI parameters of the source water, and then as soon as I measure the pool, once it's full, I do that. I keep him in the loop as we're starting up the pool, so that he can document this. And because if it comes back to there's a plaster problem, then he's got the information he needs as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You know, I recommend to builders, and I recommend to service techs, you know, to first of all, know where the water's coming from, you know, and to know, okay, is it this certain municipality? Is it this facility where, you know, you've got to address that. And I encourage builders, I encourage service techs to find out the municipality for the source of the water you're coming from. And you can go online, or you can go there, or you can address it, and you can get a report from that facility on the makeup of the water, pH, alkalinity, the calcium, everything they do to treat that water, if there was any particular contaminants at any particular time at certain levels. I mean, you can get a really good overall picture of the source water, and they're actually required to provide that to anybody you ask. And I encourage you do that, just from a standpoint of looking, you know, where's this water coming from? What are some of the contaminants that have been reported and dealt with? It just helps you to kind of start off on the right foot, I think.
Yeah, we get that from our water district here at the house all the time. About 4 times a year, we get a report of everything that's in the water. And I think that's an important relationship for full service techs to build a relationship with their water district and get those reports and know what's going on. Because there are other things in the water other than just things that affect the LSI. I follow Erin Brockovich, who's an activist for clean water.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's another one.
And she's constantly posting about different towns. There are contaminants we don't think of in our water.
Oh, sure.
Agricultural runoff, pesticides, fertilizers, prescription drugs that get flushed down the toilet or that run through our bodies and end up in the sewer systems. And a lot of times even the water treatment systems don't have the means to treat the worst case scenario of these things. You mentioned the Milwaukee, that what was happening. That was a yearly thing when I lived in Colorado in Vail. They tell people don't drink the tap water every spring for exactly that reason. The snow melts, it overpopulates the river with giardia. and the drinking water plant just can't handle it.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I use that one example about the iron bacteria situation, but I'll tell you another one too that we've come across, and that is now a lot of these municipalities are practicing what they call chloramination. So actually what they're doing is they're creating chloramines. Now, Dave, in pools, we try and keep chloramines out of the pool.
Right.
Now a lot of your municipalities are actually taking chemical ammonia and chlorine and mixing those to create chloramines. And the purpose of that is to allow the chlorine to it's a slower release of chlorine. Chloramines are kind of very long lasting. And so to keep the chlorine residual in the pipes until it gets to the house, that disinfectant. But the problem is now you're putting that in the pool and you're putting chloramines, primarily they're monochloramines that are going in, but they can convert to dichloramines. So they can really, if you're doing a major fill or if you're topping off a lot in your pools, this is where I come across this. And I come across it a lot with public pools primarily, where they're indoor pools that are just having severe chloramine issues, which are causing odors in the facility and that kind of thing. And then we come to find out that they're doing quite a bit of top off because they get a lot of splash out or whatever's going on. And their municipality is doing chloramination, and they don't recognize that. So they may even be topping off and they're not adding any additional chlorine. They're just assuming, hey, I've got to fill the pool up. They do it. And then now their combines are going up and up and up. Odors are being created and things like that. So that's another one. I actually worked with a YMCA facility. They were having issues, and then I just asked the guy, I said, hey, contact your municipality and ask them if they're doing chloramination. He did, and sure enough, found out, and they gave him the levels, they gave him everything. And once he recognized that, when he did his top offs and when he filled, he knew that he had to do that at sort of an off time when there weren't swimmers around. And then he would have to add some liquid chlorine, enough to where it would break up those monochloramines, and he didn't have the problem.
Interesting.
Another thing that there's more to it even than just the source water, on how a new pool can get contaminated. And the pool that Dave and I are working on right now, starting up, is a perfect example of that. This house was under construction for what, Dave, 2-3 years? And
yeah, we did the underground plumbing on this at least 2.5 years ago. So it's been sitting under pressure for 2.5 years. So
with water sitting stagnant in there. So the minute you prime those pumps and fire it up, the whole area is permeated by a rotten egg smell. And I think especially for the service, that's where the service guy and the pool builder need to really have that communication, and so that the service guy knows that this is what happened, this is what's going on. And enzymes, I think, are a big key to treating that. When
Absolutely.
I started this pool up and got it going, put enzymes in it's a vanishing edge pool, put enzymes in the surge tank, put enzymes in the spa to get them through the spa jet lines. But if you don't clean that out, you've got to start for biofilm, and you'll fight that for forever.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's a tough one, and I've dealt with that somewhat too. I've dealt with that even in some situations where they've got a spa or a pool in a public facility, a very old facility, and maybe they haven't been running it. And then they go through the season, it's not running. Then they start it up, and you just get a ton of debris and so forth from those pipes that comes through, and it can really wreak havoc and just cause discoloration, stains, all kinds of things. Really have to be prepared for that.
Yeah, and the other thing is guys are using variable speed pumps to save energy, and they're using big pipes, and so the water doesn't necessarily move through the pipe fast enough to really scrub that if it has started a biofilm. So you need to run the pump speeds up a little bit and kind of scrub that off occasionally too.
I agree. Yeah. Any better movement, I think from time to time is just needed overall.
Yes. Can we transit? Last time we spoke, Terry, and just so you all know, we had a great interview with Terry, a couple of months ago now, Terry, and then
Yeah.
we had to scrap it because we had some audio issues that came up later. But you were really speaking on that we talked a lot about liquid chlorine and kind of the history of it and how it's really prevented lots of things and outbreaks in the US. And I thought that was fascinating. Can you just talk a little bit about that, what we spoke about last time?
Sure. And I just, I love kind of talking about the fact that I think everybody sort of refers to it as liquid chlorine in the pool industry. And I just love to really state that that's kind of a misnomer. It's really not liquid chlorine. It's a chlorinating compound. Mm-hmm. And liquid chlorine is a part of it, but it's basically what we call sodium hypochlorite. And pretty simple. I mean, starts off with salt, and salt is converted with water and electrolysis, and we create liquid chlorine. And then they add some sodium hydroxide to it as well, which balances out the pH more. And it really is the end product is basically what we would refer to as bleach. Right. So pool liquid chlorine is basically a concentrated strength of like household bleach, what you would get in the market. So if you think of household bleach, it's about 6% strength. And the liquid, like somebody, if they're using liquid chlorine, a Hasa liquid or something, it's 12.5%. So it's over twice the strength. And bleach has a fascinating history to begin with. It goes back to the 1700s, and sodium hypochlorite goes back to the 1700s, being used for the prevention of widespread disease and things like that. It was used in London, in the Thames, to prevent cholera. Here in the U.S., going back to drinking water, there were thousands and thousands of cases yearly in the 1900s of cholera and typhoid, those kinds of things. And a lot of deaths as a result of that, until they started to treat drinking water. And sodium hypochlorite was one of the primary things they used for treating drinking water. And as a result of that, you had basically the death rate of typhoid fever from 1920, thousands of deaths per year, to getting up to around into the 1960s, you had 1 or 2 maybe annually as a result of that. So it really worked from that standpoint. The other thing that I think is really fascinating is I read an article recently about in San Diego, the cases of hepatitis A from the surge in homeless. That's a tragic thing in our day right now, but lots of homeless people in the streets, and of course, lots of things happening in the streets now. So a lot of bacteria being spread, and they had in I believe the summer of 2014, it was skyrocketing cases of hepatitis A. And one of the things that the city did to quell that outbreak of hepatitis A was they began a practice of washing the streets down with sodium hypochlorite, liquid bleach, to do that. And as a result of that, lots of other streets like LA, Long Beach, Pasadena, different areas now have that practice of washing their streets down with sodium hypochlorite. And so I think that the cool thing that I just like about bleach is the fact, I mean, I know a lot of us, we've been using it in our pools for a long time. And I think that over the time and throughout history, bleach is it was primary for a while, then it got pushed away because, tablets and, things like that, floaters, feeders, more convenience or whatever, then it became more of a shock and that kind of thing. But I think just the importance of really seeing that if you look at any kind of catastrophe, any kind of disaster, hurricanes, earthquakes, things like that, where sanitized water is needed, liquid sodium hypochlorite is the first and preferred form of chlorine that's going to get sent to wherever that's happening. And if you look at the CDC pages, you look at the WHO, water quality associations, different things like that, they all recommend for disinfecting your water, drinking water, cleaning up flood waters, cleaning up your house, your home from mold, those kinds of things. It's liquid sodium hypochlorite is what does the job for that. So I think it's a pretty cool and pretty utilized product.
Barry, I have a question on that because as a builder, oftentimes I'm meeting with clients initially to discuss their desires and that. And a couple of things. I have two questions. We hear so often, and I know the service guys hear this so often too, that, well, I'm allergic to chlorine. And my understanding is that rate of allergic reaction to chlorine is so infinitesimally small that it's more usually a reaction to imbalance in the water. Can you talk about that just for a sec, so that I, as a builder, can explain
absolutely.
that to my clients?
I think it's not so much chlorine that they're allergic to as it is the byproducts that can be from chlorine. And the one in particular I can tell you, which can cause some pretty severe allergic reactions, is if they are at a point, or for whatever reasons, they have some majorities of we call them trichloramines, or it's also referred to as THM, trihalomethane, which, by the way, in drinking water municipalities, they work very hard to ensure there's no trihalomethanes present in the water at all, because they do cause irritation, they cause skin problems, disease, lung problems, eye problems, lots of things. And so I agree with that. I think it's byproducts that are more so causing these irritation, skin irritation, things like that, as opposed to just the pure chlorine in the water.
Well, and talk a little bit about, we've been talking about how chlorine is beneficial, and essentially it is one of the elements that has kind of wiped out some of these ailments that have plagued society for many, many years. We get the pushback from clients so much of, wow, chlorine's dangerous and that. And it seems like we're coming out of that a little bit, but it seemed like for like the last decade, chlorine had such a bad name. I think some of it was perpetrated by the salt manufacturers as they were, salt systems were coming more online, and salespeople were really kind of misleading clients, and some of that still sticks. And so can you kind of tutor me a little bit as a builder, how to talk to my client and tell them, that chlorine is actually a really good thing?
Yeah, and first of all, I laugh when you talk about the salt manufacturers and their thing of safety, when it's like what they really didn't tell people is that, hey, we're putting a small chlorine manufacturing plant on your pool. I mean, the end result is still chlorine, which is safe chlorine, by the way, again. And the one thing I always say, there is so much misunderstanding and so much misnomers about chlorine and out in the public, and of course we won't get into the media and things like that about chlorine and the safety of chlorine. But I always say that chlorine used properly is probably one of the safest, most efficient ways that you can deal with not only bacteria, not only viruses, things like that, but just overall contaminants, non-living contaminants, oxidation. It's one of the best sanitizers, disinfectors, oxidizers that we have available. And I still think the safest. Where we run into problems is with the misuse, the mishandling of chlorine, things like that. So where it's either not used properly, in other words, not enough is used, there's not proper oxidation. I think, the pool industry is just, we've gone milestones and just advanced so much with these things like ozone and UV, those kinds of things to help out with the oxidation of chlorine, because I think a lot of times people are not using chlorine in the proper method to where they're getting the sanitation and they're getting the proper oxidation and proper ORP and everything. So I think that's a big part of it. I think also where we run into problems is when it's misused, when it's mixed improperly. I think some of the biggest chlorine issues really aren't specifically chlorine issues. In public pools, I see where, there's improper interlock and you have muriatic acid mixing with chlorine, and now you're creating, a chlorine gas, which causes problems. I remember, just back when I was servicing pools, I had people that just because of something they read, they felt like chlorine was just evil. and they thought I was going to kill their dog, you know, if my dog
Right.
drinks the pool. And, you know, I would very politely have to say, you do realize that the water coming out of your tap could have up to 4 parts per million of chlorine in it, and that we've been drinking this water safely and animals have been drinking it since the 1920s. But I just think
Terry,
there's, you know, that kind of thing goes around.
Yeah.
Terry, that's a point that I have when I talk to customers who say they're allergic to chlorine. True chlorine allergy is incredibly rare.
I agree.
Maybe even non-existent
I agree.
other than in people's minds. But the first thing I ask them is, what do you have for a whole house water treatment system? What do you have removing the chlorine from your source water? Because when you're standing in the shower, you're going to inhale more
Yep.
chlorine, especially where chloramines are used in the treatment. You're going to expose yourself to more chlorine potentially than you could in your pool. Now, a lot of the issues that that people have with chlorine is the way that it's dosed and the way that it's managed.
Correct.
And so there's a whole debate about the amount of cyanuric acid that should be in the pool, and I don't think we have time to really get into that here.
Right.
That'll be another one.
Other than to say, you know, the way that so many pools are managed, once a week, all the chlorine for that week is added. And that's why tabs and dichlor and those types of compounds became popular. But you have a very, very short sweet spot in time during the week when you really have the ideal amount of chlorine in the pool. The rest of the time, you either got, if the pool's being used, you either have too much or too little.
Yep.
Sure. Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, you know, if you think about it, the EPA mandate for chlorine is 1 to 4 ppm. On a public realm, it should be no higher than 4 ppm. So, I mean, let's just think about that. How many pools do we know are running higher than 4 ppm? How many pools do we know? I mean, I can tell you, I always tell the story about when my son went to a water park, you know, with his youth group or whatever, and I could smell him coming home 2 blocks away.
Mm-hmm.
Before he got in the house, I could smell him. And when he came in, he almost, you know, his hair was blonde almost. And I went to this water park. I talked to the operator. I found out they kept their chlorine at 10 ppm or above.
Wow.
All the time. Yeah. And I mean, and that's going to just react, and it's going to bleach things out. And that's where you run into problems. So I think it's misuse. And that's where I think education comes into play, you know, things like, you know, CPO and, you know, CPSA, all the things we do, you know, to educate people on the proper use of chlorine, the proper use of water. And again, I think the reason why I'm so passionate about source water and understanding source water, I'm also really a person who's passionate about dilution. And I know it's a weird thing, and I know in the US everybody freaks out about water and water use and droughts and all this kind of stuff. But I just think from the standpoint of chemicals and health and safety, some good proactive practice of diluting water and keeping that water fresher, the quality. I mean, when you talk about things like high TDS, high calcium hardness, high byproducts, all those things that collect, those all affect humans. It all affects their eyes, their skin, and those kinds of things. And that's where we have the problems.
Well, let me ask you this. You mentioned that there is salt in liquid chlorine that's a component of the chemical compound. Also muriatic acid, there's salt in that as well, right?
Correct. Well, muriatic acid is a byproduct of making liquid chlorine. So
right. So in terms of something we can kind of relate to, say we have a gallon of liquid chlorine, how many pounds of salt are in that bottle?
Well, so typically the kind of standard on that is a pound of salt per gallon of chlorine.
And how about muriatic?
Muriatic, I'm not so sure about. It's not a pound, I can tell you that. It's less. I just, right off the top of my head, don't know how much less it is.
And see, I found that out the hard way. I was managing a pool back in the 80s, before salt generators really came onto the scene. And it had an automatic dosing system. It was an 80,000 gallon country club pool that was wall-to-wall kids. So we were pumping a ton of liquid chlorine. And within 6 months to less than a year, we're getting complaints that the pool tasted like ocean water. They were tasting salt. I'm like, what the heck? Why would that? And I bought a salt sodium chloride test kit and measured it. And sure enough, I had 4,000 parts per million of salt, and I hadn't added a pound of it. It came from the liquid chlorine.
Yeah, you could have put a salt generator on that system and just kicked it in, and you would have been good.
Well, I started doing that later on pools. It's if you're gonna add that salt, you might as well put it to use and
yeah.
Cut down.
And this is again, Dave. This is again why I'm kind of a proponent of dilution too. I mean, you do need to do some dilution in whatever you're using, and so and I get people that I know somebody said this to me once somewhere. Like they said, well. Liquid chlorine doesn't work because all you're doing is you're putting salt in the pool. And I had to kind of scratch my head a little bit on that. Like, what do you mean? He said, well, it's just going to turn into salt, and salt doesn't do anything. And I was kind of like, okay, well, first of all, there is some sanitation and disinfection taking place first before that all happens, and it does, but the thing about it is, so that's increasing TDS. And, again, as I said, you got to watch your TDS and you've got to dilute. Okay, that's fine. But let's look at some of the others. So let's look at, so if you look at trichlor, okay, you're putting 6 parts per million of cyanuric acid for every 10 ppm of trichlor, and that doesn't go away. And that's contributing to TDS, okay? Calcium, if you're using calcium hypochlorite, okay, you're putting about 8 ppm for every 10 ppm of calcium hardness into the pool. That doesn't go away. That rises. That's a part of TDS. And so when people bring this thing up to me about liquid and the TDS and all the salt and everything, I kind of say, well, okay, look, if you've got really high levels of CYA, and particularly if you're a public pool, you're going to be mandated, you got to keep that CYA managed, and you've got to drain a lot more to manage that CYA, correct? Rather than just chloride salt, okay? Right. Calcium, the same thing. And if your calcium levels go too high and you've got a heater, you're really risking that you're going to create calcium carbonate on that heat exchanger, and you're going to ruin heat exchangers, which is much more costly, and there's more draining involved as well. So I kind of, from that scenario, I say, hey, look, yeah, liquid's going to contribute some salt, sodium chloride, TDS, okay? I look at that as that's probably the least detrimental form of TDS you can have in the pool as compared to CYA or calcium.
That's right. One of the things, getting back to the builder relationship here, and it's something that Dave does on every single pool, is he provides a chlorine and pH dosing system, an automated system, and everybody says, oh, it's commercial pools only. On residential pools, the best way to manage TDS and chlorine and all the chlorine problems, to my way of thinking, the best way to do it is to dose properly. And these systems dose 2 ounces a minute or a little more, and the chlorine levels stay consistent, they stay right. You can maintain them at a lot lower residual, which means the less chlorine you pump, the less salt you're adding, the less TDS. And so the one good thing, in my way of thinking, that salt systems did for our industry was it got people used to spending a certain amount of money on a water treatment system added at the equipment pad. Well, now for just slightly more money than a salt system, you can completely control your pH, you can dose the chlorine properly, and you can still have a freshwater pool. And Dave puts on every one of his pools, and his pools are a dream to service because of that. It just takes away so many problems.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of automation and feeders, anything that makes something foolproof where you don't have to depend so much, at least day in and day out, on the possibility of human error, because I think that's a big factor. I think that's a big factor from just service techs who, it goes back to training again, and it goes back to education. And I always tell my story. When I started out servicing pools, which was a long time ago, I was trained by a guy who told me, just drop the reagents in the pool and look at the flash. and if it flashes this much, put in a quart. If it flashes this much, put in a gallon. I mean, the guy was an alchemist, it's like, or I don't know, a guru or something, but that's how I was trained, so I think training and education and understanding go a long ways.
And that's how I was trained too. And as I got better test kits, and I learned what you can really ascertain from a flash test. If it turns yellow, yes, there is chlorine in the water. If you drop the phenol red in there, and yes, there is pH in the water as well. But as far as anything meaningful, if you're still doing that, you're not serious about your craft. And we talk about that and laugh about that now, Dave. And it seems like the Stone Age or archaic compared to what we have today. I mean, today we have so much with digital devices, digital testing, phone apps. I mean, good night. If I had phone apps that could tell me how to dose and so forth, or even figure out my Langley saturation index when I was doing pools, I think, my hair wouldn't be as gray as it is now, it's just,
Hey, Dave, so I was going to ask a question to Penn. Penn, what are the percentage of builders that are actually speccing in automation systems? Is that becoming more and more popular? Is it just the big builders that are doing that? How many builders are doing that?
I think it's still, at the high end. And I think, some of the manufacturers are really trying to bring that down into more of the residential market.
Sure.
And, as a builder, I think you just need to educate yourself a little bit to be able to explain it to your clients. And the way I explain it to clients is simply that I can give you perfectly balanced water 7 days a week, 365 days a year, as opposed to, if you have your service guy come in and he's coming in and he's only here 1, maybe 2 times a week on your typical pool, you've got these big undulations in your chemical quality, and then you throw an entire soccer team in there on a Saturday after the pool guy's been there on Friday because you're a good customer and you have Friday service, the kind of the premier. By Monday, there's no chlorine in there. And so it becomes really easy as a builder to sell the system, especially now that if you do your research, there are systems out there that are, they're maybe 50% more than a salt system, but the clients almost invariably always talk to us about a salt system because they all have heard that, and to take them to the next step to full automation is not as difficult as it seems, because like Dave said, everybody's wanting to they're expecting that there's going to be some sort of an upcharge there. So I think we're starting to see it really come down into more the mainstream marketplace. But I really think that as we're learning some of the dangers of cyanuric acid and that, and as builders, you really need to kind of do some of that research. It becomes a more compelling argument that you can make to the end user and to your client that automation is, it's very beneficial, and it becomes easy to sell the more you understand the systems.
And for people who are trying to minimize their exposure to chlorine, you're going to expose yourself to a lot more chlorine in a salt pool potentially than a properly dosed, chemically automated pool. You can keep the chlorine levels very steady at a part per million, or maybe even a little less based on the ORP. With a salt system, it's a dumb machine in that it has no intelligence built into it. It doesn't measure the water. It doesn't dose according to what's going on in the water. It doses according to the percentage that you set, and that percentage means that you set it for 60% out of every hour. That's going to be on 60% of the time. This is very similar to a Rollichem with a dial on it. A chemical pump with no control on it is just going to pump when based on a timer. It has nothing to do with what's actually going on in the water. So there's going to be times when there's way too much chlorine in the water, or times when there's not enough. A proper ORP-based dosing system is really the best way to keep just the right amount of chlorine in a pool.
Right.
Yeah, and I think I was just going to say, David Penton, I talked about training and education, and I think that training and education goes to the consumer as well. And I think that the fact that you're doing that is just fantastic. I mean, that's what we need to do. We need to educate. And we have consumers that are a lot more savvy. They're a lot more, we have the internet, we have all these things. They can check things out, and sometimes they can get the wrong information as well by checking that out. But, it's great to have guys like you to educate them, to tell them. And my last kind of note that I'll say here too is, I can't stress enough that, as far as exposure to the wrong type of chlorine or combined chlorine or higher levels of chlorine. And again, I'll put my little plug in. That's why I'm a fan of liquid, because the higher you've got to keep that cyanuric acid, or the higher that cyanuric acid is, the higher the chlorine levels have to be that people are exposed to. So managing that in a Rollichem feeder or something like that is just a really great idea.
Yeah, and I'll just make one quick point here on this. The consumer they've gotten to the point now where automation is a part of their life. So it's not as tough a sell anymore. You have Nest thermostats that know when you're home or when you're coming home and things like that. So they're becoming more accustomed to having these systems that do exactly what they want them to do. The Google Home, all of those things. So it's for the builders out there that are really concerned with, well, how am I going to sell this, this $2,500 piece of equipment? Well, you've been selling $1,900 chlorinators for a long time because the consumer wanted it. You learn to create your sales pitch. And then at the end of the day, another benefit to the builders is that now you also have pH balanced water, and you have everything. And so you're losing a lot of those kind of issues as well about, somebody putting too much acid in there and, stripping the copper in a heater and staining your plaster. Sure. I mean, it solves a lot of problems for builders too.
Right.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. Really good point.
And I think to the service point too, Dave, on Rockwell, we talk a lot about the training side, the education side, and educating yourself on how these automated systems work is important, because if you take over a pool or whatever and you don't know how to work an automation system, you better figure that out. So that's important. And all the manufacturers provide that training for each individual product, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that part of it is still in its infancy. Dave and I visited a manufacturer that was promoting a chemical automation system, and they were actually saying, oh, it's just for commercial systems. They didn't see the need or the benefits of having it on a residential pool. So there are manufacturers that do have systems that are geared toward the residential market. I think we're going to see more and more of it, but I definitely encourage pool service techs to learn this technology, learn the benefits of it, learn how to operate these systems, learn how to maintain the water with one of these systems, and it'll be the best friend you've ever had, the best ally you've ever had servicing your pool. But it's a discussion that needs to continue, and a level of education, and these things need to be promoted, I think, even more than they already are.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much,
Terry. Oh, go ahead, Terry. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I think it's going to become a lot more prevalent as time goes on. And, prices will start to come down. They'll become more affordable, and it will definitely be the wave of the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Terry. We appreciate having you on. We'll probably talk to you in the future. We come to you as an expert in many areas chemistry related. So thank you so much. We appreciate it. Stay safe out there, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you guys. Have a good one.
All
Thanks,
right.
Michelle.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dave and Dave.
Thanks, Terry.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
A new voice in the industry, a resource for all, education for you. This is Pool Pro Podcast. Build relationships and share important news as we get ready for our next backyard adventure. Pool Pro Podcast. Backyard adventures are better together. Please take a moment to share, like, and review our content with all of those that would be interested.